I look at streamer fishing with a jig very similar to like a nymph, and like my mentor, Mr. Humphreys, would always say, the difference between a good day nymphing and an okay day is usually one split shot. And I feel very strongly about streamer fishing in the same sense. I just want my streamer in that strike zone and at the speed that the fish want. And if I do that, I feel like having just a couple patterns and a couple different weights, a couple different colors, I can pretty much cover 95% of my bases. So what we have is basically like an 8-pound test mono system. We have a 4X tippet. We're going with a pretty heavy Sculp Snack jig. And maybe we have fairly fast water, moderate depth. We're going to go maybe have our marker, cider marker, maybe about 3.5, 4 feet. Kind of use that. We're going to try to go as vertical and just try to jig the fly more up and down. This is a kind of a short little pocket where I don't want to really drag my flies. I want to kind of keep them in the pocket, and when you're jigging the flies, we're going to try to just kind of keep the fly underneath the rod tip and just kind of work it nice and slow in the pockets. In water where I want to move the fly a little bit faster, I'm going to keep the rod tip further downstream and kind of pull it, kind of move it faster. So that's one of the things you can think about is if you want to kind of keep in the pockets, try to keep the rod tip a little more over the fly and just work it nice and slow vertically. If you want to try to burn the fly, move the fly a little bit faster, move the rod tip downstream, and then kind of just encroach and kind of move the fly a little bit faster laterally with the rod tip. Just take your time, get in position here. But once I get in position, kind of looking at this, like we have our bowl, kind of the deepest part of the pocket, like kind of right here, kind of shallows out. I'm going to just try to get kind of at least across right before it starts shallowing out. And you know, every time you move, just try to develop a little situational awareness. Trees around you. Think about this. I mean, it doesn't always, you can overreact and get excited, you kind of forget all this stuff, but think about how you're going to be making your cast, your anchor point, your presentation, and also in the event of fish strikes, think about the direction you want to move the rod tip so you're hopefully setting the fly into the fish's mouth rather than hunting squirrels in the trees. So we have a little bit of our anchor point. Making a cast. We're going to let this fly drop a little bit, and we're going to just kind of keep the rod tip kind of just right over top. There's a little bit of an angle, but I'm just moving the fly up and down, up and down. In this type of turbulent water, water's broken, lots of white water. I don't want to move the fly too fast downstream. I just want to kind of keep it jigged in the pocket. Again, with this technique, I'm just using the cider more as a depth gauge. When you have this much weight, this is a heavy bead. When you have this much weight, when the fish strikes, as long as you have control, you're going to feel the strike. But if that was a fish, if I'm working the fly and I keep getting stuck, just notice the height of the cider. Hold it a little bit higher. If you're not hitting bottom, drop it a little bit. But once I make this cast, a couple little strips, little hand twist retrieve, and then just short little movements. I'm lifting with the forearm. I'm not really snapping my wrist. All it is just I'm basically lifting the fly and I'm dropping the fly, lifting the fly and dropping the fly. I'm not doing too much of an erratic motion. Trying to do everything I can to keep the fly under constant tension from start to finish. And when you watch your cider, think about almost like you're trying to just flex the cider. If you watch your cider and you see your cider jumping 6-7 inches off the bottom, you're pulling your fly 6-7 inches off the bottom. All I'm trying to do is achieve depth and basically just make this short little lift or little pulse with my forearm, just kind of sending some movement into the fly without lifting the fly too high in the water column, because if I lift my fly too high in the water column, I blow my anchor and I lose contact. Just short, little pulses, lifts with the forearm. Another thing about this, when I'm working this, I have tree branches above me. You can use a strip if you want, where you're stripping, but what happens is if I'm making a full strip, if the fish eats, when I'm at the end of my strip, I've got nothing but the rod tip to have to lift to set the rod tip, to set the hook. But with this, when I make the cast, a little hand twist retrieve, if a fish does hit, I can use a combination of just a very short movement with the rod tip along with my line hand strip setting. So I like the hand twist retrieve, especially when I have obstacles above me. And I don't want to use entirely the rod tip to set the hook. Just nice short little movements, hands stay together. Pop, 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 pop. Fish just fly out. And what I'm going to do now is just one of the advantages with a heavier fly in a mono system is that you can normally pace yourself or get yourself a little ways away, but with the mono and the heavier fly, you can kind of keep most of the line leader off the water. Kind of feel the bottom, big boulder, move down. Kind of feel your way around. Yeah, good spot here. Little pitch. Bad anchor point, bad cast, come back. Anchor, flip, drop it, and just work it right there. There we go. That fish ate the fly on the drop, which is pretty cool. Knowing that you actually have some decent amount of line leader control during the drop. Feels like a decent fish. I'm not going to try to force this one too much. Keep the rod tip, try to keep its head down as much as I can. The other thing is just trying to think about where I'm going to land this fish if possible. When I'm landing the fish, I don't want to force, I just want the fish to relax while I'm repositioning. If I start yanking on the rod tip, it's going to go. I want to keep the fish kind of in front of me right here. So I just maintain slight pressure. If that, the fish doesn't remember it's hooked as much, it's not going to move usually as fast. And with this, I'm just going to keep slight tension, try to position myself downstream of the fish, lift up, let the currents bring the fish right to me. And there we are, we have a gorgeous little brook trout. Find my footing. Big boulder, you don't want to step off that. All right, we're back in the same boulder here. Okay, we're just going to use it also to get a little more distance. I might just use a little bit of a haul with this cast. I think one of the most important things I notice myself doing and a lot of my students when I'm teaching tight line nymphing or any like jig streamers, especially in pocket water, is having a clean transfer from line hand to rod hand during the strip. And what I mean by that is often the idea with this approach is that you're trying to keep as much line leader off the water as you possibly can. If I make a cast across stream and then look for my hands and try to drop, and then look for basically put the line hand to my rod hand and look down and drop my rod tip, I'm putting that line leader in the water, I'm getting sucked back towards me. So when I make this cast, I usually like to have one of my index fingers or middle fingers out, I'll make a cast and I can focus on keeping the rod tip up and looking at the target and just basically laying that line on my finger, and then I can kind of curl it, and then gives me control from start to finish. But have something that's easy for your flies, your line hand to transfer it over, so the line leader remains nice and high, and you have control. Because just like before, well, it's nice when this works, because I was getting my ass kicked just a few minutes ago. But just having control from start to finish, I feel like I've deja vu, been here before. Grab my net. I'm going to try to just position this fish. I don't usually like, in this type of water, I don't like having to drag the fish up into the current. I do like just try to at least get over along the bank, keeping the rod tip down, and then trying to position the fish in front of me and just let the current bring the fish to me. So about a rod's length of line out, slide her around, rod tip up, head up, bring her right on in. So we're going to talk about jig streamers and just kind of a basic approach. What's neat about jig streamers is it doesn't really matter what type of pattern you're using. There's a couple things that I'm looking for when I'm fishing a jig streamer from a design standpoint. One, I want all the weight or most of the weight on the front end of the hook, like a clouser. But anytime that you impart movement with the rod tip or the line hand, you want the head of the fly to go up, but then as soon as you relax the tension, the mass in the front end is going to get the fly to kick downward, but it gives that fly a nice up and down movement. And I think one of the common mistakes I would make earlier on when I was tying streamers is I would tie a tungsten bead, tungsten cone head, and then if I was going to use additional lead wire, I would wrap the entire lead wire over the entire length of the hook shank. And even though the fly will drop, it has more of a level drop, where I find with this approach, maybe because it gives the fly a little more movement, but I really want that head to drop and lift. And the more you focus your weight on the front end, the more movement, animation that fly is going to have during the retrieve presentation. But there are basically like three that I use, and the first one is a Jiggy Fry. This is just a variation of a pattern I picked up from a guide in Michigan. This was imitating salmon smolt or salmon fry, young of the year, but also this is just a great little pattern that can imitate young of the year brook trout, young of the year brown trout, or if you're fishing systems that have young of the year perch. This is such a great little pattern. This is not a fly that I'm fishing in like really heavy turbulent water. I fish this in like a smaller size with a lighter bead, like basically like a 2.8 millimeter bead, something pretty light, but it just does a nice job imitating young of the year. Also, anytime I intend to, I don't always fish two streamers, but if I'm ever going to be fishing a two streamer rig, this smaller, lighter weight version is really nice to put either on the point or on the dropper, to kind of act as kind of like sealing the deal. Often you'll have fish that will maybe follow the larger, brighter streamers. They'll follow this in, and all of a sudden they see the smaller fly either hanging off the dropper or on the point, and this is kind of something that you can kind of seal the deal with. When you're fishing double streamers, you can do that, but definitely have patterns that are contradictory. You may have a pattern that is a little flashier, a little more vibrant, and then you're going to have one that's going to be a little bit more neutral, a little duller, and this is where the Jiggy Fry comes in place. So great little pattern, but this is not something I'm going to be fishing in really heavy water. Usually it's single, lighter flies in shallower water, or I'm going to use this in combination with a heavier fly to use as my anchor. This is the polar jig. And the polar jig is just a very simple pattern. I think one of the things about jig streamers is that they need to be simple for a couple things. One, this is not a pattern that we're trying to get to move, swim in a serpentine motion. We're not trying to get this fly to kick erratically. the main idea with this approach is trying to achieve depth as quickly as possible. So what I'm looking for is materials that, one, when I build this fly, I may have some Flashabou, or I may have like a polar chenille wrap with some rubber legs, but basically once this fly gets in the water, it's streamlined, it's going to drop fairly fast. The other part about this is once it's down the bottom, I want materials that breathe through the water, meaning that when I start imparting movement with the rod tip, I can feel that fly like literally sliding or slicing through the water column. And anytime I feel any sort of resistance, I'm going to set the hook. And sometimes if you have a material or a pattern that's too big, too bulky, when you're working it, it kind of feels like you're pulling a wet sock through the water column, and that feels like you lose a lot of the connection with your flies. And even when you're fishing water that's fast and turbulent like this, sometimes all you're going to feel is just like a little bump, a little hesitation, and that's going to be enough for me to set the hook, either using the rod tip or using the line hand to use a strip set. So that's the polar jig. And the last one is the Sculp Snack jig, which is kind of a larger, heavier version of the polar jig. This is kind of basically the trademark of what I use with the original Sculp Snack. I like the Sculp Snack as a really nice single hook point streamer pattern with a cone head, but I have really kind of fallen in love with the jig approach. And this is where just tying this pattern on a jig hook with a heavily weighted tungsten bead, it allows me to really work this fly deeper. This is a fly that anytime I'm really trying to work the depth, something I'm trying to really achieve depth in like really fast, turbulent sections of water, this is where I'm going to use this pattern. And it doesn't really matter what the pattern is or the weight. The approach is that you're just simply pitching the fly upstream. Usually it's an upstream presentation. You're trying to allow the fly to drop. If you're fishing deeper water and you're trying to keep the fly in play, you're going to use more of an up and down movement with the rod tip to kind of keep the fly just moving up and down, and you're basically holding the fly underneath the rod tip. If I'm fishing skinnier water, and if I'm trying to fish the bank, or I'm trying to pull that fly, kind of create more of a reactionary strike, I'm going to pitch the fly and kind of move the rod tip and use the rod tip to literally pull the fly laterally and with speed across the shallow waters, hopefully to entice a strike. But these are the three approaches, or the three patterns, and I feel like no matter where I go, like usually this is all I need. And what I might end up doing once in a while is obviously you have some different sizes to imitate different size bait fish, but more importantly, I'm going to be looking at the bead size. We talked about like when you're making a cast upstream, if you don't feel like within the first one or two strips or moving the rod tip, like you feel like the tension or tightness, you usually don't have a heavy enough fly. So I may tie this fly in maybe sometimes 2 or 3 different bead sizes. If I pitch a cast up and I feel like I'm still loose and not super tight, I'm not feeling any sort of knock during the lift of the rod tip, I'm just simply within like 2 casts, take this out, put another one on with a slightly heavier bead, and then go to work. If you're hanging up all the time, you need to go a little bit lighter. But I'm going to change just maybe 2 or 3 different weights within the bead size, and then just colors. Most of the time, I don't change colors as often as most people think. Usually, if I'm not catching fish, usually I'm going to change my depth that I'm working my fly, maybe the speed that I'm moving my pattern through, or the height in the water column, and then if nothing that works, then last resort is actually maybe changing colors as a last resort. But for the most part, I feel a lot of this presentation is about getting your flies down in the strike zone, keeping them there, and just working them. And if that doesn't work, then a fly color change or a completely different fly pattern may be in order. But most of the time, I really feel if you have a good presentation, your fly's in the strike zone. I look at streamer fishing with the jig very similar to like a nymph, and like my mentor, Mr. Humphreys, would always say, the difference between a good day nymphing and an okay day is usually one split shot. And I feel very strongly about streamer fishing in the same sense. I just want my streamer in that strike zone and at the speed that the fish want. And if I do that, I feel like having just a couple patterns and a couple different weights, a couple different colors, I can pretty much cover 95% of my basis. All right, let's get in position here. We have some overhanging brush, and this is where we're going to just kind of use more of a wet water tension cast, but we're going to just basically just kind of like a stiff arm, where we're going to drift the forearm, drag the fly in the surface, and then just kind of pitch it underhand. And the key with this is that when you're dragging the flies, you have a heavily weighted fly, it's sunk. if you try to make a cast with the fly sunk, you're having to break all that surface tension, and you find that your flies just don't go anywhere. So what we need to do before we begin the acceleration with the pitch, we need to start sliding, bring that fly up near the surface, and then pitch it. So the hand's going to be kind of forward, rod tip's going to be back. We're going to just drift, and then pitch it. Drift and pitch. There we go. Well, smaller fish, but we'll take it. But, oops. But this is where one of the things is that when you make this hook set, again, just knowing where you're going to set the hook down to the low, but also with the hands are together, I was able to use a little bit of a strip set. Even though I have a limited range of motion, I can still get a decent little set. So a little pitch, start twitching. Now this is shallow, and then also you'll notice I got trees right there, so I can't really lift vertical, so I'm kind of forced to go a little more down, a little pitch, drift. There was another little fish bumping. But even when I'm sliding it downstream, I'm just trying to move it at a very slow little pace. Just trying to flex that sighter off the water, lift and move. And usually in this type of pocket water, usually if the fish are on, they're going to hit it in that first 1 or 2 runs. So I felt like I did a decent job hitting this. Now it's time to move out and work this deeper water up above. Obviously, if you're trying to position yourself in pocket water, try to find the downstream side of a boulder. That way you have a little cushion here. As before, just trying to identify your position, where you're at. A little flip, got plenty of space. Let that fly drop a little bit, and we're just making these short, little upward pulses with the rod tip. A little pitch here, a little tension, a little pop. We're going to work that soft edge. I'm just letting that slider just kind of sweep down a little bit before I begin imparting movement. This is kind of a funky little hydraulic. I'm seeing my sighter like quickly sweeping over. So this is one of the cool things you can pay attention to, is that the sighter is also kind of a directional tool. I may have made a bad cast and maybe put my streamer a little too far over that faster current. So if I see my sighter angled a little more across, that tells me that it's picked up by a different current. And if you see your sighter chasing something downstream or across stream, you're out of position. So I'm just going to try to get a little more below it, directly over top, cast straight up, and just work it. Keeps the flies a little bit more in play. Straight up. Oh, that was a good fish. Recompose. Drop it in there. I might just see if I can give that fish just a second break. I'm going to work over here. There's just a nice little slot below this boulder here. Drop it in there, let that sighter drop. Just pitch. And one of the ways you can tell whether or not you have enough weight is, I mean, with this approach, you're basically just kind of jigging it underneath the rod tip. If you're making a cast and that current is pulling the flies downstream too fast, and you feel like you've got no control or connection, chances are you don't have enough mass. So this is where just adjusting the bead size is going to help you. If you have that tension from start to finish, you're good to go. But if there's no tension while you're making this upward movement, if I can't feel the flies lift on every lift and drop, chances are you may not have enough weight. There's another fish right there. So, the other thing here is I've been bouncing rocks back and forth. Just check your hook points. Sharp hook, bad hook set probably. Let's go back to see if we can get this one to come back. A little twitch, drop it. Got sucked into a different current there. We're going to go a little more on that softer edge, try to hold the rod tip over. This is where the longer rod tip is going to help. Now, in truth, this is a 10'3". This is kind of a wonky rod. It's more designed for ultralight Euro nymphing. And with this rod, with a streamer hooks have a much heavier gauge wire. So when you're setting the hook, you need a little bit more force. And sometimes I find that I am missing fish, or I'm getting very poor hook sets because there's just a little too much give in my rod. So if you're finding out that you're just making lots of sets, you're getting lots of eats, and you're just not connecting securely half the time, you might be fishing with kind of too soft of a rod tip. And right now, I'm kind of on the borderline right now. I have a pretty heavy jig, really soft rod. And I'm finding that I have like a 50% hookup ratio, which isn't bad, but it could often be a lot better. Nice slow up and down movement. I'm right in that zone. All right, I want to make one more cast up to the top here, work it, drop it. I want to make one more cast. One of the things about this approach as well is that when you're casting a heavy fly, when you're shooting the fly out, if the line straightens out and hits the reel or kicks back on the reel, it's going to cause like a recoil. So one of the things is that when you're fishing heavier flies, have a little bit of line to shoot during the cast to prevent that kickback. It's going to give you a good cast. So if you're finding that the flies are coming short or falling way short of the target, even though you've got plenty of line leader, just let a little bit of line slip. And that's going to basically just kind of dampen the blow, allow that fly to land nice and smoothly rather than getting pulled or jerked back towards the angler. And that is incredibly important when you're fishing really heavy patterns, nymphs or streamers. Have a narrow little seam here. Enough line. Make a good cast this time. Drop it. A little further out. I have a little bit of pocket below this boulder here, right below the whitewater. We're going to try to go a little more vertical with the jig, try and keep it in that pocket as long as we can. It's not a great looking spot, but decent enough. Better anchor point. Drop it. There we go. So just working those edges. Nice smooth. Get down. Yep.